Short summary. At the morning market in Novgorod, in the shade of wooden stalls, a poor honey seller suddenly has her weights checked, and everything around her freezes, as if before the tolling of a bell. She faces disgrace and expulsion from the square. I welcome everyone listening to this story and ask you to write in the comments where you are watching from. It is important for me to know how far apart our listeners are. I hope you enjoy listening. In 12th century Novgorod, the morning began with the smell of smoke, wet bark, and sourdough. At the market, between rows of cloth bundles, pots, and dried fish, stood a woman named Nadana. She sold honey from 2 barrels and carried flat mugs with her to pour for hurried boat owners and women in woolen scarves. Her hands were stained dark from the honey that had soaked into them, and in her bag lay a birch bark letter tied with linen thread. She had been carrying the letter for a long time, but had never shown it to anyone, not out of pride but out of caution. Dry birch bark broke easily, and there were already enough cracks in her life. Nadana lived on the Nevsky end, in a cramped hut next to the masts and ropes drying on the shore. Her husband had been killed in a forest ambush, leaving her with a young daughter and a long memory that did not help her in trade. She woke up before the first roosters crowed, rearranged the barrels, boiled water, and made sure the weights didn't get damp. The weights had come from her father, a sturdy craftsman who once scared away hungry teenagers with a single glance. Her father died of winter fever, but before that, he gave his daughter that very birch bark letter. He said that the letter recorded the debt of one of his Artel's boyars for saving a caravan, and that his father had been promised compensation and protection. Nadana did not like the word protection. It sounded foreign in her language, where drilling with ice and carrying until your shoulders are blue were more important. But she still carried the letter because her father had asked her to. On that day, a new deputy from the warrior boyar came to the market. His name was Mikula, and he moved slowly, not because he was old, but because he liked to watch people rearranging goods, bumping elbows with their neighbors, and how everything froze when he put his finger on someone else's weight. Behind him walked a clerk in dark cloth clothes, with a neat knife for birch bark and a leather pouch on his belt. The people at the market already knew. If Mikula stopped at your table, checked your mugs, counted your coins, and demanded extra tax, it was useless to argue. He said he was protecting order. People knew he was protecting the boyar's money. Mikula chose a moment when Nadana's stall was crowded with customers. He pointed to the weights and gestured to weigh a mug of honey. The clerk watched the scales pointer and made notes on birch bark. When the scales balanced, the clerk said emotionlessly that the weights were light. Nadana objected calmly, without complaint, and suggested weighing it again on her neighbor's scales. Mikula nodded as if in agreement and allowed it. The same result was obtained on the neighbor's scales. The clerk noted that the merchant had false measures and that she was to be disgraced in trade and expelled from the ranks. The crowd receded like water from a boat's hull. People looked away. No one wanted to quarrel with the governor. Nadana felt not fear, but emptiness. It was a familiar emptiness, like after a sleepless night. She took the birch bark letter out of her bag, carefully, so as not to touch the damp edge. The clerk glanced at it and smiled. He said that the old birch bark proved nothing, that the seals on it were invisible, that the debt had died along with those who had written it. He listed the ways in which such letters were often forged, and added that the boyar had his own scribes and his own seals. There was no malice in his voice, only weary superiority. Nadana did not argue. She asked that the verification be postponed until the evening, and that her case be considered at the Veshe. She said she had witnesses to the old events. The clerk shrugged as if he didn't care, but Mikula smiled slightly and gave his permission, because the crowd loved spectacle, and he loved it when the crowd saw who was in charge. As Mikula left, a young man named Namil lingered at Nadana's table. He was not well liked. He was poor, spent a lot of time at the pier, sometimes got in the way, and earned small change by helping to unload barrels. He was considered intrusive. People often brushed him off. He looked at the barrels with unfinished curiosity, as if he saw something that others missed. He whispered that two strangers, clearly from the other end of town, had been hanging around the table at night, and that one of them was holding a bag of small weights. He was afraid to say it out loud. People didn't listen to him, and Mikula might punish him. Neda nodded. She knew it was dangerous to believe the boy, but not listening to him was even more dangerous. She hid the barrels in the shade, tied the lids with rope, checked the weights again, and left for a short while to visit a familiar herbalist in the Plotnitsky end. It smelled of dried mint and burnt grass there. The herbalist, short and sturdy, knew more about honey than any merchant. She showed her how to check the weights with grain and water, and gave her some advice. To throw in the same pebble, dried in advance, to see if the weight changes due to moisture. Nadana thanked her, took a flat stone pebble, and returned to the table. By noon, the Varangians had arrived at the market. Their boats had docked at night, but people only noticed them now, when men with red beards and gray eyelashes walked between the rows to buy leather belts and bread. Among them was a guest named Halfdan. He was not the largest or the loudest, but he carried a sea animal bone in his hand, polished to a smooth finish. He had been told that in Novgorod, such a piece was convenient for sharpening knife blades. He stopped at Nadana's table, inhaled the smell of honey, and asked through an interpreter to pour him a mug. Nadana poured it without haggling. She didn't have the strength to haggle. Halfdan drank, nodded, and reached for his coins. Then he saw a linen thread and a piece of birch bark on the edge of the table, which caught his eye like a fish bone between his teeth. He quietly told the interpreter to ask the merchant where the letter came from. Nadana explained briefly. The debt was old, the memory longer. Halfdan looked at the seal again, and something changed in his eyes, like a man who recognizes a sign forgotten many years ago. Halfdan did not rush to speak. He asked Nadana for permission to come to the evening gathering. He said that once, in these parts, he had been given a herbal decoction when his men had run aground and sat in the water all night until the locals pulled them out. They were treated by women on the Nerevsky end. They said that the Varangians were guests, and that guests should be given drink if they did no harm. He said he remembered the seals on some letters because in his youth he had carried gifts and letters from prince to prince, and had seen many seals. The interpreter diligently conveyed the meaning. The people around listened, but pretended to be indifferent. The Varangians were rarely listened to, but sometimes they brought the right words. There were a few hours left until evening. Nadana managed to see Namil, who was hanging around again. He said that 2 strangers had asked about her weights, and that one of them had gone to the clerk in the neighboring shop. He added that he had seen a stranger's hand rest almost imperceptibly on the edge of the bowl during the morning inspection. He wasn't sure, but he whispered about it. Nadana took the herbalist's pebble, put it on the scale, and weighed the same portion several times on the stranger's scales at the neighbor's. The weight was the same everywhere. She concluded that there had been interference that morning. The evening in Novgorod was noisy. People were called to the Vesh. They flocked to the square. The prince's men stood aside. The elders on the platform talked among themselves without raising their voices. Mikula looked confident. The scribe held his birch bark strips and a knife in his hand, ready to cut new lines. Nada held her letter with 2 fingers, as one would hold a candle, so that the wind would not extinguish it. Halvdan stood a little apart with 2 Varangians, the interpreter whispering hurriedly to him. First, they talked about other people's business, about bridges, about fishermen, about ransom for merchants who had been detained downstream. Then it was time to negotiate. The clerk presented his claim. He said that the merchant had false weights, that she had deceived people, and that she deserved punishment. He added about her barrel of honey, her dubious mugs, and the faint seal on the old letter. He said that those who have old debts often hide new sins behind them. He spoke without malice, like people who have repeated this speech many times and are tired of it. Nadana stated her case. She said she was ready to check the weights on any scales and asked to use the herbalist's method with a stone to rule out moisture. She said that when she checked the scales in the morning, there was someone else's hand on them. She did not accuse anyone by name. She stated the facts. She added that the birch bark letter was not an empty thing. It bore the seal of a family that was indebted to her family. Her voice was even. She did not ask for pity. The elders allowed the checks. The crowd moved closer. The pebbles settled, the mug filled, and the scales balanced. On the foreign scales, they balanced. On the third, they balanced. The clerk frowned and asked to weigh on the very scales where the false measure had been revealed in the morning. There, too, the scales balanced. He said that the water had dried up, and that was why the readings had changed. The crowd began to murmur. Mikula raised his hand to silence everyone. He proposed to mitigate the punishment, but not to cancel it. Since the sin had been committed in the morning, and in the evening it was as if it had disappeared. His words sounded as if the outcome had already been decided. At that moment, Halfdan stepped forward. He asked to see the letter. The elders allowed it. The Varangian held the birch bark as one would hold a sword, carefully and respectfully. He looked closely at the seal. He told the translator to convey that he saw on the seal a sign that he himself had once worn on his belt, because this sign was given to guests who had saved the boyar's people on the river. Halfdan recalled those who pulled him out of the water and the herbal decoction that gave him strength. He added that the symbol on the seal matched a rare pattern made by a single craftsman. He named the place where he had seen this pattern, the very workshop where he had once been stabbed for bread and help. The elders ordered that the master engraver be summoned, if he was still alive. The master was alive. He came, listening to the conversation, and looked closely at the seal. He said that the pattern was his work, that he had made such a seal many years ago at the behest of a boyar for debt certificates, with common people for firewood and help. He added that such seals were not issued often because the boyars did not like to put good deeds in writing. The crowd sighed. The clerk pressed his lips together. Mikula stood motionless. The elders began to talk about the debt. They started asking questions about who Nadana's father was and what kind of caravan he had saved. Nadana replied, her father worked with carpenters, helping to reinforce the footbridges. And in that sad year, the boyar's people were returning with furs when they were trapped by ice and water, and her father and others pulled them out at night. He burned his hands and then coughed for a long time. He was promised payment and a place to trade without offensive duties. The payment never came, and the place was constantly taken away. She told everything calmly, without embellishment. Her words sounded like a tarred rope, strong and dry. Halfdan listened and remembered. He said that his friend at the time had visited the carpenter's house with his daughter, who was learning to read on birch bark. He said that he had been told about a girl who quickly understood the symbols. He looked closely at Nadana. His gaze was not one of surprise, but of recognition. He told the interpreter that if this was the same girl, she could have saved not only his people from fever with her potion, but also him from a bad deal. She had read someone else's letter and warned him that the sign was not what had been promised. He said he had to keep his word in her favor. The elders nodded. They did not like it when strangers interfered with the order, but they liked it when a stranger spoke of duty and memory. They asked why the Varangian was so sure. Halfdan replied without pathos. He had seen seals many times. He kept records, and his memory held patterns, smells, and numbers. He was not boasting. He was stating a fact. He described the pattern of the boyar's seal, a small animal in a circle, the lines of its ears, an asymmetrical paw. The master seal-maker confirmed this. He added that he had made this asymmetry in order to distinguish the real seal from a fake. Nadana's birch bark had this very asymmetry. The crowd came alive not out of anger, but out of clarity. They loved clarity more than shouting. The clerk crumpled the strip of birch bark in his hands. He said that the question of the morning check still remained. He again spoke about order and sin. And then Namil stepped out of the crowd. The people began to murmur. They did not like it when, contrary to the unwritten rules, the one who was usually driven away came out from the edge. Namil lowered his head and began to speak. He said that at night 2 men had approached Nadana's table. He described their clothes. Strangers, not from this end. He said that one of them was holding a bag with small weights, and that in the morning he saw a stranger's hand resting on the bowl during the inspection. His voice trembled, but he spoke clearly. He added that he had no idea who these people were working for, but he was ready to show the bag he had found in the crack between the boards. He placed a small bundle on the ground. Inside the bundle were 2 tiny inserts for weighing scales. People reached for the bag. The clerk said it could be a coincidence. Mikula remained silent. The elders ordered the guards to be called so that they could confirm or refute the boy's words. The guard came and confirmed that he had seen 2 people at the tables that morning, but did not think anything of it. He said that one of them had previously worked on inspections at the other end, and had recently been visiting the clerk frequently. The clerk blushed and said that many people visited him. His voice became dry. The elders turned back to the birch bark. They said that duty was not an empty word if the seal was genuine. They asked if the boyar was alive. It turned out that the boyar was ill and his affairs were being managed by his close circle, and at the market by his deputy. The square fell silent. People feigned indifference, but they were tense. The elders suggested calling 2 old men who remembered the story. A gray-haired helmsman stepped out of the crowd. He said he remembered the night of the rescue. Nadana's father was going into the water, and then they tied a knot in the rope around his wrist, so that he would not go under the ice. The helmsman showed his old scar and said it was from the same rope, because he was holding the other end. He added that after that night, the boyar sent a sign of gratitude, a pattern with a beast. His words coincided with the seal. The elders looked at Mikula. Mikula decided not to back down. He smiled weakly and said that all this was old news and that the situation required fresh solutions. He suggested giving Nadana a few days to repent and then returning her to her place in the middle ranks, but not to the princely granaries. He hoped that the crowd would agree to this compromise. The crowd remained silent. Then Halfdan said that he was ready to settle the debt right now. He would take on the payment to Nadana, so that her family would get what they had been promised, and the city would save face. He said he was doing this not as a stranger, but as someone who was indebted for the potion and for the warning that had saved him from an unfavorable deal. His words were clear and simple. He did not ask for permission. He announced his decision. The crowd began to buzz with excitement. An unexpected benefactor. They did not say it aloud, but that is how they felt. The elders exchanged glances. They liked it when money settled disputes, but they did not like it when a stranger did so. Then the master printer spoke up. He said that if the seal was genuine, then the boyar's family should pay the debt, not the Varangian. Otherwise, it would be a violation of the family's honor. His words were simple. If the family seal is valid, the family pays. It was not an attack, but a rule. And then something happened that no one expected, but which had been quietly building up. Halfdan asked to speak again. He said that he knew the mark not only as a seal of debt, but also as a sign that he had once encountered during a matchmaking ceremony. Many years ago, one of his comrades had sought to marry a distant relative of the boyar through the women of the Nerevsky End. And then an elderly woman had come out and said that there was a connection, although the marriage had not taken place. He described the ornament around her neck, a simple plate with embossed lines of an animal and a curved paw. He turned to Nadana and told the interpreter that the woman was her grandmother. If so, it turned out that there was a kinship between Nadana's house and the boyar's family, albeit through matchmaking and rejection. The elders exchanged glances. They knew that even a failed matchmaking connection leaves traces in the memory of families. It is a hidden kinship, a thin thread that is invisible in the hustle and bustle of bargaining, but which stretches across the years. The elders ordered confirmation. An old woman named Avdotya came forward from the Nerevsky End. She said that her mother had indeed negotiated with the boyar's family when she was looking for a better future for her niece. She said that they had not reached an agreement at that time because of the pride of the boyar's family, but there had been an exchange of tokens, and the seal with the crooked paw had been given as a sign of the girl's family's honesty. She pointed to Nadana's birch bark. The pattern was the same. Now these words fell into place like a stone in a masonry. Nothing fell from the sky. Everything had been prepared. Mikula realized he was losing ground. He tried to steer the conversation toward the lost weights. He said that sometimes poverty drives people to cheat. His voice remained even, but his eyes flashed with irritation. Then Namil picked up the bag and offered to weigh the inserts. He said he didn't know who had planted them, but he was ready to face the whip if he had lied. His words sounded louder than his strength. For the first time, people looked at him as someone who could take a punch. The elders ordered the inserts to be weighed. The readings turned out to be exactly what could have distorted the morning's weight. The guard confirmed that he had seen the checker near the clerk's bench. Then one of the men who had previously helped Mikuli looked away and confessed that, on the governor's orders, he had been watching some of the merchants and that they were rewarded for everyone caught using false measures. He said he didn't know who exactly used the inserts, but he had his guesses. He didn't give any names, but his trembling voice hinted at a system. The elders made a decision. They said that the birch bark with the seal was recognized. The debt of the boyar's family was no fairy tale. The family was obliged to pay. Until payment was made, The merchant was provided with a place near the prince's granaries and protection from arbitrary treatment. An investigation was ordered into the morning inspection, with the participation of the guards and the master of weights. During the investigation, the governor was removed from market inspections. The clerk was ordered to appear with his books and explain his connections with people from other regions. The decision was announced without fanfare. The crowd exhaled. Nadana nodded like a person who had received not a gift, but an equal account. After the meeting, life did not immediately become easier. The location near the prince's granaries meant stricter eyes and sharper shadows. But people with money came there, and the honey sold faster. Every morning, Nadana put the same amount of pebbles in the measure to feel a sense of constancy. She did not stop wearing birch bark, but now kept it in a wooden case from the herbalist. The Varangian Halfdan did not visit her every day, but when he did, he paid more than the honey was worth. He said that this was how he was paying his debt, until the Boyar family made a decision. He did not impose himself. He was a guest who remembered. Namil began to come to her to help. At first, people laughed, saying that the merchant now had her own guard. But the laughter died down. Namil proved to be quick-witted, a fast learner, knowing how to untangle a rope with one hand and how to hold a barrel on a slippery board. Nadana paid him fairly, without mercy. She gave him the pebbles to hold and told him he was responsible for keeping them steady. It was his responsibility and his honor. He was quietly proud. Governor Mikula was temporarily suspended. His people were noisy, but without their former confidence. The clerk walked around the market, played with his knife, and pretended that nothing had changed. He sometimes glanced toward the barns, but looked away. Rumors spread that the boyar was seriously ill, and that those close to him were arguing about what to do: admit the debt and pay it off, or stall for time. The elders reminded them that they had a decision from the Vaish, and that the whole city was responsible for the decision. On the third day after the Vaish, a seemingly mundane incident turned everything into a short domestic thriller. In the morning, Nadana found a thick bundle of birch bark tied with simple twine on her table. There was no mark on the bundle, only a rough inscription carved with a poorly sharpened knife: "Wait." The word could mean anything. Nadana felt a chill in her stomach. She did not untie the bundle on the spot. She asked Namil to take it to the herbalist and open it there, in front of witnesses. No one at the market wanted any more surprises. 3 people gathered in the herbalist's hut: the herbalist herself, the master of weights who lived nearby, and Namil. The bundle was cut open. Inside were 3 neat lead weights and a thin leather strip with cuts in it. A symbol resembling a claw was scratched into one of the weights. The scale master frowned and said that these were inserts of the same type that had been found at the Vaish. He added that the leather strip helped to secure the insert so that it could press on the bowl unnoticed. It was not a verbal threat. It was a threat of action. Someone wanted to repeat the stolen technique or frame Nadana. The situation went from simple to tense. The herbalist said that it couldn't be kept in the hut. It had to be taken to the elders. Someone noticed them on the way. Nadana felt that they were being followed. She did not turn around. She heard quiet footsteps and knew that any rustle would echo off the walls in the market. She did not run. She walked steadily. There was a guard standing by the barns, the same one who had confirmed Namil's words. He noticed them and raised his hand. They showed him the bundle. He called another guard. They reached the elder's house. Inside, it was cool and empty, like a boat without cargo. The elder listened, looked at the weights, and said quietly that this was an attempt to revive an old game or drive in a new stake. He ordered the guards to increase surveillance in the market. That same day, Mikula went to the boyar's house. He asked for a meeting. He was refused. At the gate, he ran into a relative of the boyar, who said that the city was noisy and that they did not want even more commotion. Mikula returned with a stony face. The next day, he came to the market without the right to inspect, but with the air of a man who wants to show that he is still the boss. He was surrounded by a large crowd. He stopped not far from Nadana's place and began to ask someone about the price of cloth. He pretended not to see her. By evening, there were already 2 Varangians standing by the barns. Halfdan approached Nadana and said that he had some old news. One of his former comrades had returned to the city later and brought with him a small wooden board with a crooked paw symbol carved on it. He said that this board had been part of marriage negotiations many years ago, and that 2 lines were carved on the back, a sign of consent and a sign of refusal. He showed that only the sign of consent had been carved on this board. This meant that the matchmaking was almost complete, and the refusal came after. This strengthened the family bond, even if it was not consummated. Halfdan added that he was ready to hand the board over to the elders. He did not smile. He simply fulfilled his obligation to remember. The elders accepted the tablet and ordered the boyar's relatives to be summoned. They came with weary faces. They knew that ancient symbols were no better than new swords. They could not be dismissed. They spoke quietly for a long time, like people who count years rather than coins. In the end, they acknowledged the debt. They said that the boyar's family would pay Nadana the agreed amount. It was not in the form of mercy, but in the form of debt. They asked the city to accept their payment without protest. The elders nodded. The decision was written on birch bark and sealed with the master's seal. The crowd heard and did not shout. They made noise, but it was a different kind of noise, one of relief. Mikula realized that his mask was slipping. He tried to wriggle out of it. He said that the payment by the clan did not cancel out the morning's offense of false measurement. Then the master of weights brought the lead inserts he had found and showed them together with the leather tape. He calmly explained how they worked. He said that the morning check could not be considered clean. He added that a new check would require a different deputy and different people, and that there were those in the city who knew how to check without pressure. The master's words sounded like a hammer on a nail. without embellishment, neat, at the right time. The elders made their decision. They announced that they were removing Mikula from all trading activities for a long period of time and transferring the inspection to a guild of craftsmen known for their strict standards. They instructed the clerk to hand over the books to a new scribe. The clerk did not argue. He suddenly felt very lonely. That evening, a little honey was poured out at the barns, not for a celebration, but as a gesture of equality. Nadana poured some into a mug and placed the glass in front of Namil. She said that he had saved her business with his little word. He bowed his head, blushed, and stumbled over a barrel like a little boy. But people were already looking at him differently. He was no longer an intrusive beggar. He was the unsung hero of the day. They didn't give him a wreath, they gave him a job. To keep the new scales nearby, to keep an eye on the measurements and order next to the merchant. It wasn't a favor, it was a role. The Varangians left the city a few days later, but Halfdan left a translator with a letter for Nadana. Written on birch bark, it said that he recognized the connection through an old matchmaking agreement and his debt for the potion, and that if she ever needed help with her case, her word would be heard in his winter hut. It was not a fairy tale promise, but a bridge carved with a knife into the bark of time. Nadana placed the letter next to her father's letter. She compared the seals and smiled restrainedly. Both were genuine. Rumors about the scroll and the inserts did not subside. The elders instructed the guards to patrol at night and track down those who tried to repeat the setup. A week later, the guards caught one of the old governor's assistants. He had 2 more inserts and a leather strap with cuts in his bag. He did not confess who had sent him, but that was not necessary. Everything fit together. He was punished without ostentatious cruelty. He was forbidden to work at the market and ordered to pay money to the community. It was not blood for blood, but account for account. The boyar's family sent the payment on the appointed day. It was not a fortune, but a reasonable amount, which, however, stopped Nadana's hand from trembling for the first time in a long time. According to the decision of the Vesh, she was allocated a permanent place near the prince's granaries. This place not only provided her with customers, but also the obligation to keep perfect measure. Nadana accepted the second with the same calmness as the first. She continued to put her pebbles in measure, so that each new day would look like a clean slate. After a while, the master printer offered to teach Namil to read birch bark. He said that the city lacked people who could understand the symbols quickly and did not crumple the bark. Nadana agreed. She did not make any grand statements about destiny. She simply sat the boy on a bench, gave him a birch bark knife, and showed him how to make the incision shallow enough so as not to tear the bark. Namil learned patiently. His fingers did not immediately get used to the delicate work, but he had a natural desire for precision. He soon figured out the first lines, and the city gained another person from below, who was drawn not by fame, but by knowledge. It was a continuation of the hidden talent versus status twist. this time not only in Nadana's past, but also in Nemil's present. Life went on. The weights were checked again at the market, but without pressure and without hidden hands. People said that now the market was breathing a little more evenly. It was not a fairy tale. There were still shouts, birds chirping, and quarrels between farmers and boatmen in the city. But next to the barns stood a table where honey was poured evenly, and where birch bark lay not for fear, but for memory. Sometimes someone whispered that Nadana was related to the boyar. She replied that the connection through matchmaking was not a privilege, but a reminder of how long the threads stretch, and how easy it is to break them. She said this without malice. She simply put a period where others like ellipses. When the Varangians came again in the spring, Halfdan was not with them. Others came. But the interpreter conveyed a verbal bow and said that in the distant winter quarters, they were talking about a woman from Novgorod who had kept her place not by shouting, but by writing on birch bark. That did not make her a saint. It made her stubborn, like an elm tree in wet soil. The people listening to this short story by the barrels nodded. They loved stories with a clear moral. One evening, when the fog rolled in from the river and blinded the eyes, Mikula approached the barns. He stopped at a distance, looked at the table where the new inspector now sat, and at the boy who was cutting straight lines on the birch bark. He did not come closer. He turned and left. He no longer had a place in this corner of the city. His removal was not an act of revenge, but a natural outcome. Thus justice was served without loud words. The mask fell before the man left, and when he left, no one had to rejoice in someone else's misfortune. That evening, Nadana tied the old birch bark letter with new linen thread and placed it next to Halfdan's letter. She closed the box and hid it in a wooden niche. She listened to the noise of the market, which did not cease even at night, and realized that she was not afraid of it. This noise was no longer a threat. It became the background to her equal labor. She did not win with a sword or a cunning trick. She simply finished what had begun many years ago, when a girl with rough fingers learned to read from bark. In this simplicity lay cathartic clarity. This story is not about a miracle, but about details, about a crooked paw on a seal, about pebbles in a measure, about a leather strap with cuts, about a board with a sign of consent, about the voice of a boy who decided to come out of the shadows, and about a guest who remembered someone else's potion. Every surprise was anticipated by these little things. The ending was not a gift of fate, but the sum of equal choices. The elders preferred clarity. The Varangian preferred duty. The boy preferred truth. And the merchant preferred patience instead of shouting. The city, accustomed to noise, heard not shouting this time, but a common reckoning. Someone said that the birch bark letter rewrote the court. The herbalist replied that the letter was just a knife to the bark. People rewrite. And in 12th century Novgorod, there were those who did not flinch when it was necessary to cut cleanly.